My goal tonight is to teach you something about science in general and evolution in particular. I'm going to assume that you're intelligent, but to some degree uninformed about these fields. There are some common misconceptions about the theory of evolution, but basically it just says that all living organisms on Earth today are descended from a few species that lived many millions of years ago. One big misconception about evolution is that it's somehow anti-God. But in fact, nothing in evolution argues against the existence of God. I believe the process of evolution is part of God's creation. Another big misconception is that evolution is, quote, just a theory, unquote. But in fact, there's extensive evidence for it, and that's what I'm going to tell you tonight. When we want to understand or explain something, we use the scientific method, which is really just careful application of common sense. First, we form a hypothesis, and then we test it. We do this by deriving deductions or predictions that follow logically from the hypothesis, and then testing those predictions by observations and experiments. A good hypothesis has to be, in principle, falsifiable. That means there must be tough tests which, if the hypothesis were really wrong, would disprove it. Then, if the hypothesis passes all those tough tests, we conclude that it must be true. So let's take a look at the hypothesis of Dr. Hovind concerning the history of life on Earth, creationism. This says that the Earth and all living species were created in 1 week, about 4000 BC. Species don't change, and the Earth's features were shaped pretty much by a worldwide flood about 2400 BC. Now, 200 years ago, pretty much everybody accepted this. Even Charles Darwin was a creationist as a young man. But then people began to test it as a scientific hypothesis. And it failed all the tests. It became clear that the Earth is much older than 6,000 years. It's millions of years old, that living species can change over long periods of time, and that there just isn't any evidence for the supposed worldwide flood. So, Charles Darwin came up with the hypothesis of evolution by natural selection. This says the Earth is very old. Living things can change over generations, many generations. Living species can diversify into 2 or more separate species, and all species on Earth are descended from a few ancestral forms that lived in the distant past. The idea of evolution had been around before Darwin, but he made 2 big contributions. First, he proposed a plausible mechanism for how living things could change, natural selection. This says there are inherited variations among individuals. We now know that this is due to chance mutations, genetic mutations, and second, variations which favor survival and reproduction will be selected because they have a better chance to make it into the next generation. Similarly, unfavorable traits will be discarded. Darwin's second big contribution was that he followed the scientific method very explicitly, deducing predictions from his hypothesis and then testing them. And I'm going to go through Darwin's deductions as well as some more modern ones. Darwin's deductions number 1 through 4 were tests of natural selection. There isn't time to discuss them now, but it has been well established by field studies and mathematical models that natural selection works. In fact, it's got great practical relevance to understanding things like antibiotic-resistant germs and pesticide-resistant insects. Even creationists acknowledge, as they must because of these examples, that natural selection works, but they claim that it can only lead to small genetic changes. In fact, given enough time, major changes are not only possible, but inevitable. For example, in human cells, about 50 to 100 mutations creep in per human generation. That's not much, but if it goes on for 1 million generations, several % of the human DNA will have changed. So small changes can accumulate, and given enough time, the character of a species can change significantly. Now, this implies, from this it follows that if evolution is true, the Earth must be a lot older than 6,000 years, and it is. Astronomy, geology, and biology together provide us with a coherent and consistent view that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Now, we can actually date rocks fairly precisely using radioactive atoms, and I want to take a minute to explain this. Radioactive decay is where one kind of atomic nucleus decays into another, like rubidium-87 decaying into strontium-87. The decay occurs at a constant rate, which is expressed as the half-life, the time it takes for half the remaining rubidium nuclei to turn into strontium. And we know the half-life of rubidium-87. That can be determined. So basically, if we measure the ratio of rubidium-87 to strontium-87, we can figure out how old the rock is. In practice, rubidium-87, strontium-87, and another strontium isotope are measured in many different minerals within the same rock. And the results are plotted. If the rock is just formed, those will form a straight line. But if the rock has been around for a while, and if the composition hasn't changed since it was formed, the points will fall on a straight line called an isochron, and the slope of that line tells the age. Here's an example of a rock from Michigan that was dated this way at 3.5 billion years using 30 different minerals within the same rock. Results can also be checked by using other isotopes. There's quite a few different isotope systems that can be used. The take-home lesson is that radioisotopic dating is really far more sophisticated and reliable than creationists would have you believe. Okay, so far we have a mechanism for gradual genetic change and enough time to account for lots of such changes. But has evolution really occurred? Well, Darwin's deduction number 6 is that if evolution has occurred, then species that lived in the remote past should be different from those that live today. And we can test this because we have fossils. It turns out that the vast majority of fossil species are different than those alive today, and that doesn't just include dinosaurs. Now we can actually make a more sophisticated deduction. Deduction number 7. If evolution is true, that predicts that the percentage of fossil species that are the same as contemporary species should be lower in the older rocks than in the more recent ones. Note that the older rocks are those that are lower down because they were laid down first, and the newer ones were laid down on top of them. And this has been tested many times and confirmed always. Here is some data from Lyell in 1854, which was before Darwin published his work. In the more recent Pliocene rocks, you can see here, 96% of the fossil species were the same as species that are still alive. And in the older Eocene rocks down here, only 3% were the same. Okay. Deduction number 8. If evolution is true, it must be possible to demonstrate the slow change of one species into another. In Darwin's time, there weren't enough fossils to test this prediction, but now there are. The ancestry of the modern horse, shown here, is one of the best known examples, but there are lots of others. But we don't even have to rely on fossils to test this prediction. Here's an example. Herring gulls and lesser black-headed gulls in Europe can't interbreed, and that's what defines them as separate species. But the herring gulls of Europe here can interbreed with gulls in North America, and they can interbreed with gulls further west, and so on in a continuous chain around the Earth until you get back to the lesser black-headed gull in Europe. What this demonstrates is the slow change of one species into another geographically. And there are many similar examples. Okay, deduction number 9. If evolution is true, there must be a mechanism by which species can diverge by which one species can diverge into two species. Well, there are such mechanisms. Here's how it works. Remember, a species is a population of individuals who can all interbreed. The first step is that such a population gets separated into two subpopulations by a natural barrier, for example, or maybe by occupying different niches in the environment. And then, once they're separated like that, gradual genetic changes will take place in the two populations, and they will be independent because they're not interbreeding. They will change in different directions, and that can lead to chromosome rearrangements things like incompatibility between the eggs and the sperm, and other physiological changes which result in the subpopulations then becoming unable to interbreed. So the result is two separate species. The classic example of this is the finches of the Galapagos, which Darwin studied, which got isolated on the different islands of the Galapagos, and so they diverged into multiple species. Here's another example closer to home. The leopard frogs of Nebraska can interbreed with the leopard frogs of Wisconsin. And the leopard frogs of Wisconsin can interbreed with the leopard frogs of New England. But the leopard frogs of Nebraska can't interbreed with the ones in New England. So if something were to happen to wipe out the ones in Wisconsin and others that might be in between, you would have two separate species. And that's how speciation can occur. Okay, deduction number 10. If all today's species are descended from a common ancestor, as evolution says, there should be connecting forms between the major groups. Well, this was Darwin was going out on a limb when he made this prediction. There were no transitional fossils known in 1859, but just a few years later, Archaeopteryx was discovered, which has dozens of skeletal characteristics of reptiles, such as a bony tail and teeth, but it also has obvious characteristics of birds. Feathers and wishbone and wings, for example. And many other transitional fossils have since been discovered. Now, deduction 11, if there's a unity of life based on common descent, then this should be reflected in the structure of cells. And it is. All cells have similar features. I won't go through them in detail, but then within these similarities, there are patterns of differences which are explained by the theory of evolution, but not by creationism. Deduction number 12, unity of life based on common descent predicts common molecular processes. This too is what we find. DNA, RNA, and proteins are in all organisms, and common mechanisms of metabolism. Control mechanisms. This last part means that we can learn a lot about human cancer by studying yeast. Interestingly, the genetic code is not quite universal. It turns out there are some exceptions to the universal genetic code, and evolution can predict how the pattern of those exceptions occurs, but with creationism, they ought to be all the same, or else no similarities at all. Okay, deduction number 13. It should be possible for proteins to evolve new functions if evolution is true, and it's possible. Genes can be duplicated. This involves transposons, and the mechanism is well known. And interestingly, many of these genes become pseudogenes, which don't do anything. They just sit there because the sequences that promote the gene activity have been lost. Once a gene has been duplicated, then the two genes can evolve in separate ways, and sometimes you get new proteins with new functions. There's a lot of examples of this, but it's even becoming important industrially, as in the reference that's here at the bottom, for developing new enzymes that don't exist in nature. Okay, deduction 14. If members of a group share common ancestry, this should be reflected in their anatomy. And there's a lot of examples of this. It's very familiar. The homologous bones in vertebrate limbs is just one example. Deduction 15. Common ancestry should be reflected in embryonic development. Again, there are tremendous similarities. This is because evolution works by modifying what's already there. So since mammals descended from fish, it's not surprising that an early human embryo has gill slits and a tail, which later disappear. Interestingly, astonishing progress is made just in the last 10 years in understanding the molecular biology of embryological development. So we are now beginning to learn how new organs and body plans can evolve by modification of previously existing genetic programs. This is the cover of one of the many new textbooks in the growing field of evolutionary developmental biology. Okay, evolution predicts a unique and consistent family tree showing the relatedness of different species. This sort of thing used to be done by comparing anatomy, and the idea is that there's always nested patterns when you compare different features. But the best and most reliable and objective family trees of this type come from similarities in proteins and DNA. Suppose we compare three species, a particular gene in species X, Y, and Z. We measure genetic distance between each pair of species by counting the number of differences in the DNA sequences. For example, here, 4 differences between X and Y, 4 between X and Z, and 2 between Y and Z. And based on that, we predict a relatedness that Y and Z are more closely related. I should point out this is usually done with genes with thousands of DNA subunits, and this is shown with only 6 just for illustration. But this would predict a family tree like this. And once you have that family tree, that in turn predicts that the same pattern would be observed in all genes, not just this particular one. This is pretty surprising from the creationist point of view. Compare the shark, the dolphin, and the mouse. If these were created independently, you would expect the shark and the dolphin to be more closely related in at least some genes, but they aren't. In fact, dolphins and mouse are more closely related in all genes because they have more recent common ancestors. Here's another example of a family tree of vertebrates based on a few proteins. And here's one for the entire, all the kingdoms of life based on ribosomal RNA. Okay, another deduction, this is the last one. Sets of chromosomes in related species should differ by a small number of chromosomal rearrangements. And this is always found to be the case. In fact, you can use these kinds of similarities in the same way to create family trees. And there's another example up here on this poster board you can look at later. It doesn't matter whether you use chromosomal rearrangements to make these trees, or DNA, or protein. You always come up with the same family tree, which is exactly what evolution predicts. An important and useful consequence of this evolutionary relatedness is that we can use lower organisms as models to learn about human diseases. There are 280 genetic diseases in man for which the gene has been identified, and it has recently been found that the fruit fly has 2/3 of those genes. Now, Dr. Hovind might say this is because they have a common designer, but a nuclear power plant and a light bulb are both designed by General Electric. Do you think we can learn about 2/3 of the things that go wrong with a nuclear power plant by studying a light bulb? I somehow doubt it. In conclusion, evolution is a good scientific hypothesis because it makes many testable predictions. It suggests experiments and observations that we can do, and most importantly, it's potentially falsifiable or disprovable. This means that it makes such strong predictions that if they were not confirmed, the hypothesis would have to be rejected. And I challenge Dr. Hovind to tell us why creationism deserves consideration as a scientific hypothesis. Tell us what predictions it makes. Tell us how it could, in principle, be falsified. Tell us what observations or experiments could, even in principle, disprove it. But evolution is more than just a hypothesis. Its major predictions have been confirmed, as I've shown you examples. It has withstood people's best attempts to disprove it. It stood up to some really rough tests that could have easily disproven it if it hadn't been true. For example, suppose the world really were only 6,000 years old, like Dr. Hovind says. Then we would have determined the ages of lots of rocks, and none of them would have been more than 6,000 years ago, more than 6,000 years old, and so evolution would have been in the trash. But that's not what happened. Another example, if species were really created independently, then we might have found that dolphins had half their genes similar to sharks and the other half similar to mice. And so evolution would have been disproved, but that didn't happen. Another thing about evolution is that it explains things that no other hypotheses can, and as I mentioned, it's been extraordinarily useful in guiding productive research. This is why evolution is accepted by virtually all biologists, geologists, and biochemists. And that's why it deserves to be called a theory. A scientific theory is not just a hypothesis, it's something that's been well established. And indeed, it's not only a reasonable theory, as we are debating, it's one of the most important and the best established theories in modern science. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Holvind will have 10 minutes for rebuttal, and then he will also be allotted 20 minutes to present his side of creation.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being so patient. I apologize for being late. I didn't miss. The first flight was canceled leaving Pensacola, so they said the quickest we can get you there is 5 o'clock. I said, well, how far a drive is it from there to Oshkosh? They said, 2 hours. I said, let me drive. We will cut that down some. Amen. But it's an honor to be here tonight, and I appreciate you all coming out. What we're supposed to be discussing tonight is basically the question, is evolution a reasonable scientific theory? Well, I think we need to first of all define a few terms here. Evolution has quite a few different meanings. I got these straight out of the dictionary here. An unrolling and unfolding process. The one we're discussing here tonight is probably more relates to number 4. Has to do with biology. The development of a species, organism, etc., from its original to its present state. Now, this definition of evolution is a little bit deceitful. What happens, as I'll show you in a minute, a lot of other things are smuggled in along with this definition. There is no question the organisms we have today are descended from their ancestors, obviously. And there is no question there have been some changes. Now the question is, how far do the changes go, and where do you leave science and enter religion, speculation? The Christians have no argument, the creationists have no argument with organisms changing, but we think they're limited to the same kind. Several times, Dr. Paulson tonight emphasized the changing of species, the changing of species. Well, now, species is kind of a nebulous term. A dog, a wolf, and a coyote are different species. Look them up. Canis lupus, Canis domesticus, but they're interfertile. Nobody's ever nailed down a good, hard, solid definition of species. The examples he gave of the gulls, not being able to interbreed, well, stand 30 feet away and look at it. It's still a bird. Okay, it's a gull. That's not evolution. The Bible never says they're going to bring forth after their species. The Bible said they bring forth after their kind. And just because you get two animals that end up being slightly different variety, that some scientist today decides to call them a new species, it doesn't mean they're a different kind. I did not see one example this evening so far of any evolution showing a different kind of animal. It's just what somebody calls a new species. So if we're going to deal with the development of species, organisms, etc., from its original to its present state, or that all species descended from earlier forms, I'll go along with that. Evolution happens. But that's not what the textbooks teach. They go many steps beyond this and teach the kids that all life forms came from one common ancestor. Probably all the dogs came from a common ancestor, and it was a dog. It doesn't mean the dog and the banana are related. Okay? Let's define a few more here, a few more terms. Reasonable, able to reason, fair, just, wise, sensible, not excessive. To say that a dog and a wolf have a common ancestor is reasonable, it's wise, it's sensible. To say that a dog and a banana have a common ancestor is not wise and not reasonable and not sensible. Now, if you want to believe that, that's fine, but that's not science. Science means to know, things that we can observe or test or demonstrate. A branch of knowledge, one that systemizes facts, principles, methods, skill, or technique. The basic word is knowledge, things that we can know. What can we observe, we can test, we can prove? I will contend tonight that absolutely nothing in evolution above the species level, if you want to use that word, can be proven. It's all speculation. It's all fairy tale. It didn't happen. Now, if you want to believe it happened, that's fine. You're welcome to believe that, but quit calling it science and quit using my tax dollars to put it in our school system with real science, because it doesn't belong there at all. Theory. A speculative plan that has been observed to some degree. By the first definition of evolution, yes, we have observed, there's no question, that animals can produce a lot of varieties. But I contend the variations have limits. Here's how science is supposed to work. You observe the universe, you create a hypothesis, or a theory to explain the observations, and then you present evidence to support your theory. He asked in his closing remarks if I could provide some, let's see, why should creation be considered as a scientific theory? He wants me to present some predictions. Let me give you in a nutshell what the creationist model presents, and then we'll make a few predictions. The creation view says about 6,000 years ago, there was an instantaneous creation. All organisms were created together in 6 days. I would predict, based on this, that we would find billions of examples of symbiosis relationships of certain plants that require certain animals and certain animals that require certain plants that defy explanation by slow, gradual evolutionary accumulation of mutations. I think we'll find lots of examples in nature, if you just open your eyes and look for them, things that could not have evolved bit by bit. Read Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. You'll see the irreducible complexity exists all over the universe. Then the creationists teach that these animals will bring forth after their kind. Keep that word kind in mind, not species. The argument is not about species. The argument is about where do different kinds come from. And I don't know if the kind is the same as our family level or genus level or where exactly it is. I'm not sure that our classification system that Carolus Linnaeus developed is the same one that God intended or that God made. I don't know. But I think it's pretty obvious to a 3-year-old that a dog and a banana are a different kind and a dog and a wolf are the same kind. A horse and a zebra might have a common ancestor. I wouldn't argue about that. Stand back and look at it. It's still the same kind of animal. So I predict we will find animals able to produce only after their kind, and that there will be no examples found of anything producing a fundamentally different kind of animal. A black gull and a white gull are the same kind of animal. And then, according to the creation model, there was a flood 4,400 years ago. The world was totally destroyed. I would predict, because of this worldwide flood, we will find sediment layers all over the world containing trillions of fossils of dead things. I predict that the pre-flood world was loaded with trees, and they would be buried and form layers of coal. I predict if we dig down in the ground, we will find coal, and it'll most often be found in layers, stratified layers. I predict, based upon this model of a worldwide flood, we will find petrified trees standing straight up, running through multitudes of layers, proving the layers are not different ages, like the textbooks teach. And I taught earth science for 15 years, and I'll show you pictures in a minute. I predict, based on this flood, we will find that all people in the world descended from a common family. And when you look at mitochondrial DNA and the way it slowly changes, they find, sure enough, we got a common ancestor. There's been big deals in the newspaper about that. Mitochondrial Eve. They say, oh, everybody descended from a common woman. Well, I could have told them that. I can even tell them her husband's name. And a couple of the kids. So with science, you're supposed to observe the universe, create a hypothesis, and present the evidence to support your theory. There's my theory. I predict we will find billions of dead things buried in sediment layers laid down by a massive worldwide flood. I predict we will find erosion marks that cannot be explained by the current rivers that are flowing through, like, for instance, Grand Canyon. The top of Grand Canyon is nearly a mile higher than where the river enters the canyon. That river didn't make that canyon unless you believe rivers flow uphill. The top of the Kaibab uplift is 6,900 feet at its lowest and 8,500 feet at its highest. It ranges between 7,000 and 8,000 feet above sea level. The river at the base of Grand Canyon is 1,800 feet above sea level, but the river enters the canyon at 2,800 feet above sea level. Check it out. Rivers don't flow uphill. The strata are not bended like they were slowly uplifted. It's all horizontal bedding. That Grand Canyon was formed by the flood as the flood waters ran off. Grand Canyon is a breached dam across the Kaibab uplift. There's no possible way that river made that canyon. Go to the north side of Mount St. Helens, where I was a few months ago, and you'll see the little bitty Toutle River, about 15 feet wide, flows through this massive canyon that's 1,000 feet wide. The canyon was made in 15 minutes. After Mount St. Helens erupted and blew all the mud down into the valley, dammed up the little creek, 5 days later, the river backed up far enough it got over the top of the dam, washed out a miniature Grand Canyon in 15 minutes. And at the bottom is a little bitty creek called the Toutle River. And I guarantee some brilliant professor someday is going to bring his kids down there and say, kids, you see this little bitty river? It made this big canyon. Took millions of years. No, teacher, this took a few minutes. A few minutes of a massive worldwide flood. The evolution view says we all came from a rock as the earth cooled down 4.6 billion years ago and hardened into a rocky crust. And all life forms come from a common ancestor. I think that has been proven wrong numerous times. We see no evidence of that whatsoever. The Bible warned us about science that is falsely so called. I'm convinced this evolution theory is a great exaggeration from the facts. The facts are we see animals produce variations. Darwin noticed a lot of varieties of finches, 14, varieties of pigeons. But then he extrapolated that way beyond the facts, and it became a religious worldview that destroys Christians' faith in the Bible. And it keeps non-Christians from even examining the claims of Christianity. And I think this evolution theory is not only dumb, it's dangerous. Most kids that go from Christian homes to secular schools will lose their faith by the end of their first year of college.
The 10 minutes for rebuttal is
okay.
up, so you can be able to start with the presenting your case, unless it's just a continuation. But our people will begin now to start picking up questions. But I want to remind you that Professor Paulson will be finishing with his rebuttal, and we'll make a couple of go-throughs for picking up the questions. So be sure that if you still want to wait until after Professor Paulson is done speaking, we will be picking up those questions again and going through those to be fair. I just want to remind, again, save the applause for afterwards. And I also wanted to mention that we're using this debate as a fundraising function for our student organization. And we ask that if anyone here or everyone here that enjoyed tonight's program would like to see such things as this brought to campus more often, we're doing this, we're trying to do this as best we can in a very unbiased way to moderate. We will be having tables outside where we can take your kind contributions. Thank you. And Mr. Hoven, then, you have 20 minutes for your presentation then.
All right, thank you, sir. Let me give you a little history of what happened to make this evolution theory become so popular in the last few centuries. Charles Darwin, fresh out of Bible college at age 22 in 1831, set sail on the HMS Beagle. As Darwin sailed around the world, he came to the Galapagos Islands, where he counted 14 different varieties of finches based on their beak shape. Charlie counted the finches, killed all of them he could find. He hated birds because he loved worms. He was kind of a strange fella. But Charlie shot lots of birds and collected them and put them into piles and said there were 14 different varieties of finches. He concluded that all the finches had a common ancestor. Well, I bet you're right, Charlie. It was a bird. And then Charlie said in his book on page 170, "It is a truly wonderful fact that all animals and all plants throughout all time and space should be related to each other." Well, now hold on just a minute, Charlie. You see 14 kinds of birds and you conclude the birds and the bananas are related? That's quite a stretch, don't you think? He's going way beyond the observed evidence. He left his science and went into his religion. And textbooks are really good at that, about mixing science and religion all the time. They say we can't have religion in schools. Well, we've got religion in schools as long as we have evolution in there. See, Charlie observed microevolution. Dogs produce a variety of dogs. Roses produce a variety of roses. This is a fact, folks. It happens. It's observable. And some people might call these different kinds of roses a new species, and they get all excited. Wow, we have a new species. Or a gull in this example. It's still the same kind of animal. That's not the real issue here behind evolution. The Bible says the animals are going to bring forth after their kind, not species. See, evolution is religious. There are 6 different meanings to the word. We have cosmic evolution. That would be the Big Bang. That's what the textbooks teach. 20 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang. Now, if Mr. Paulson does not believe what I'm about to share for definitions for evolution, if he doesn't think that's really fair to call that part of evolution, then please join me, Mr. Paulson, in getting this kind of garbage out of our textbooks. Because this is included with the evolution theory as far as the kids are concerned. They think that's part of evolution. Then we have chemical evolution, if evolution really happened, and the Big Bang, if the Big Bang produced hydrogen and helium, how did we get the higher elements? There are at least 92 elements naturally occurring, plus the synthetic ones. How do you get those? It's true that some of these higher elements form in stars, but now you've already got a star as a furnace or a factory to produce this. Originally, from your Big Bang, how did you get all these higher chemicals? Or if the stars evolve first, then you can replace 2 and 3, you can switch order. What about stellar and planetary evolution? Nobody has ever observed one star forming. None. We've seen lots of them blow up. Nobody's ever seen one form. And there's several out there. I mean, step outside and take a look. There's enough stars out there that right now everybody on Earth could own 2 trillion of them to themselves. That's the ones they know of. Then you'd have to have organic evolution. That's the origin of life. Nobody's ever seen non-living material come alive. The definition he chose for evolution was interesting because it started with living organisms changing. Well, okay, then if you don't believe this is part of the real evolution, then help me get this out of the textbooks, because the students are taught that non-living material came alive. They are taught spontaneous generation, I assure you. Here's a typical textbook. 4.6 billion years ago, the earth cooled down. As the earth formed, it was like the moon, and there were hot pools of bubbling lava. And oceans formed as it rained on the rocks for millions of years. Yes, boys and girls, millions of years of torrential rains created great oceans. Now, if this is not really part of the argument about evolution, then help me get this junk out of the textbooks. If you really want to make the argument about evolution, variations, 1, 2 species coming from a common kind, well, then I'll join you on that. That happens, okay? But they're sneaking in a lot of other stuff under this umbrella of evolution. This textbook says the first self-replicating systems must have emerged from this organic soup. Swirling in the waters of the oceans is a bubbling broth of complex chemicals. Progress from a complex chemical soup to a living organism is very slow. Well, I guess it is. It's totally stopped. It doesn't happen at all. That's how slow it is. But the kids are taught this kind of stuff. Now, you have to really watch this. I've learned in the last couple of years, the evolutionists are backing off of pushing their whole theory, and they're trying to get the kids to bite off a little bitty chunk and believe in microevolution, which is certainly true. They're trying to change the definition to mean only changing in living organisms after they've come alive. But I'm telling you, this other stuff is in the books, folks. This one tells the kids the humans, the birds, and the crocodiles have a common ancestor. Now, that's not observed. This is somebody's religion. They've mixed it in with science. Everything inside this circle is religious speculation. You might see a variety of crocodiles, and you might see a variety of humans coming from a common ancestor, but that doesn't prove the crocodile and the human are related. See, these evolutionists are really good, and I must admire their enormous faith. They're able to take a little bit of evidence and extrapolate it to mean a whole lot more than is obvious. They assume, because they see, several different species of gulls, that this proves the gulls and the bananas and the people are related. Then we have to have macroevolution. That's changing between major kinds of animals. That's never been observed. Speciation is not macroevolution. Microevolution, variations within the kinds, not species, that has been observed, and that one is scientific. The first 5 are religious. So when I say evolution is a religion, that's exactly what I'm meaning. And trust me, all 6 of them are put in together. This one is science, and I object to calling it microevolution, but we're kind of stuck with the word. It's just a variation, folks. That's all that's ever been observed. And I guarantee by the end of the evening, you will not have heard one example of anything above this level right here. There are no known examples of any kinds of evolution above the speciation level. The evolutionists believe all life forms came from a common ancestor 3 billion years ago. Now, today we have 250 varieties of dogs. Some say more than that. Depends how you count them. And they probably had a common ancestor. It was a dog. And some people might say they're different species or subspecies. Okay, well, you can pick any terms you want, but they're the same kind of animal. That certainly doesn't prove what the evolutionist theory teaches, that all the dogs of the world, yeah, you got a variety, big dogs and little dogs. And a 3-year-old will tell you it's the same kind. Let's take a test here. We got a dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Which one is not like the others? And a 3-year-old can figure it out, okay? They're the same kind. And this is where the argument comes in. See, the evolutionists believe all forms of life came from one ancestor, and that ancestor came from a rock. It rained on the rocks for millions of years and produced soup in the oceans, and the ocean soup came alive. That's exactly what they're teaching. And I resent that. See, they try to make the kids make a gigantic leap of faith and logic to going from the observed microevolution into believing in macroevolution. And that's where the whole problem comes in. Macroevolution is a fantasy. It's based upon imagination. And they keep arguing about where is this line. I'm sure I'll get the question later on. What's the exact definition of kind? Well, I don't know exactly. I think from the Bible we would have to conclude it's those that were originally able to reproduce and produce viable offspring. And they may have diversified now to where a horse and a zebra maybe aren't, interfertile. Maybe they still are, I don't know, but it's obviously the same kind. I think the kind was the original reproducing pairs of animals. So the number 6, microevolution, is true, but other 5 get smuggled in, and the kids are deceived. They're given one definition of evolution, like descent with modification. Like this one says, evolution is change over time. In other words, there is no doubt that living things have changed over time. Notice this now. They're starting with living things, aren't they? Well, if you want to start there, then great. Everything before that, let's help me get it out of the textbooks. All this origin of life from non-living material stuff, that stuff ought to be removed. This one says, evolution is defined as a change in species over time. Now, folks, I'm here to tell you that is not really what they mean. They're using this as a hook to get the kids to believe in evolution, and then they're going to switch it to the real definition. They're going to include cosmic evolution and organic evolution, and anybody that doesn't believe in all 6 definitions is going to be told, well, you don't understand science. Inevitably, in every debate I do, the opponent, somewhere along the line, will say, well, the average audience just doesn't understand the complexity of these things. Translated, that means, I'm smart, you're too dumb. I guarantee you'll get that impression somewhere along the line. If you listen to the evolutionists talk long enough, they want you to think you're just too dumb to understand it. You need to come to this college and take a bunch of courses so you can finally understand all the complexities of evolution. See, in advertising, it's called bait and switch. If I said, I'm going to give you a new Mercedes for $10. You showed up at my house and I said, well, I'm sorry, how about this one? It's only $99,000. That's called bait and switch. That's illegal. People go to jail for that. And I think some of these textbook authors ought to go to jail for baiting the kids to believe in evolution with one definition and then switching it midstream. And trust me, that's exactly what they do. We got no quarrel with truth, folks, and I've got no quarrel with science. I love science. But tonight, I suspect you're going to continually hear evolution trying to be smuggled in with science. And I assure you, I won't let it happen. Not under my watch, anyway. Evolution is not science. I object to lies being included in the textbooks. There is no real evidence for evolution.